October 7, 1993, 2:18 p.m. United States District Court, Southern District of New York. 35-year-old Prince Rogers Nelson sat in the witness stand of the federal courthouse, having been called as an expert witness in Campbell v. Acuff-Rose music, a landmark case that would determine the future of artistic sampling, fair use, and creative freedom in America. But when 67-year-old Judge Harold Morrison looked down at Prince with obvious contempt and said, "Mr. Nelson, this court deals with serious legal matters affecting constitutional rights, not the opinions of irrelevant pop artists who contribute nothing to serious cultural discourse," something unprecedented was about to unfold. Prince's response would not only revolutionize how the legal system understood artistic expression, but his 4-hour testimony would create case law that would protect creative rights for generations and fundamentally change how American courts approached questions of cultural significance and artistic value. If you believe that true expertise transcends academic credentials and that some voices carry authority because of lived experience rather than formal training, please subscribe to witness the moment when an irrelevant artist delivered testimony so profound that it rewrote the legal foundation of creative freedom in America. The Campbell v. Acuff-Rose music case centered on one of the most important questions in entertainment law: whether the hip-hop group 2 Live Crew had the legal right to create a parody version of Roy Orbison's "Oh Pretty Woman" without paying licensing fees. The case would determine how courts interpreted fair use doctrine when applied to musical sampling, parody, and artistic transformation. At stake was nothing less than the future of creative expression in America. If the court ruled against fair use, it would severely limit artists' ability to build upon existing cultural works, potentially stifling innovation in hip-hop, electronic music, and countless other genres that relied on sampling and reinterpretation. The case had attracted national attention because its outcome would affect every artist, writer, filmmaker, and creator who wanted to reference, sample, or transform existing cultural works. Legal scholars, entertainment industry executives, and civil liberties advocates understood that this single decision could reshape American creativity for decades. Prince's involvement in the case came through his reputation as one of the most knowledgeable artists regarding music industry contracts, copyright law, and creative rights. His battles with Warner Brothers over artistic control had made him an expert on intellectual property issues, while his success as an independent artist demonstrated practical understanding of how creative ownership actually functioned in the modern entertainment economy. The Electronic Frontier Foundation, which was supporting 2 Live Crew's position, had requested Prince as an expert witness because of his unique combination of artistic credibility, business knowledge, and experience with copyright disputes. They needed someone who could explain to the court why artistic borrowing and transformation were essential to cultural progress. Judge Harold Morrison represented the old guard of American jurisprudence, a Nixon appointee who believed that serious legal matters should be decided by people with serious credentials from serious institutions. At 67, Morrison had spent his career dealing with corporate law, constitutional issues, and cases that he considered worthy of federal court attention. Morrison's attitude toward entertainment-related cases was dismissive and condescending. He viewed disputes over music, film, and popular culture as frivolous distractions from the important work of interpreting constitutional law and protecting serious business interests. When Morrison learned that Prince Rogers Nelson would be testifying as an expert witness on copyright law and cultural significance, his reaction was immediate skepticism. In Morrison's view, pop musicians were entertainers who had no business offering opinions on complex legal doctrines that required years of formal education to understand properly. The morning of Prince's testimony had not gone well for Morrison's preconceptions. Prince arrived at the courthouse dressed in a conservative black suit, carrying a briefcase full of legal documents and industry contracts that he had clearly studied extensively. His demeanor was professional and serious, nothing like the flamboyant performer image that Morrison had expected. Prince's preliminary answers to basic questions revealed sophisticated understanding of copyright law, fair use doctrine, and the historical development of American artistic freedom protections. It became clear that Prince wasn't just a musician offering opinions. He was someone who had studied these issues as intensively as many attorneys. But Morrison's prejudices against entertainers remained stronger than his recognition of Prince's evident expertise. The confrontation came when Prince began explaining how artistic sampling functioned as a form of cultural commentary, similar to legal precedents in literary criticism and academic fair use. "Your Honor," Prince said, "when hip-hop artists sample existing music, they're engaging in the same kind of transformative commentary that courts have protected in academic and literary contexts for decades. The only difference is the medium and the cultural background of the artists involved," Morrison interrupted Prince mid-sentence. "Mr. Nelson, this court deals with serious legal matters affecting constitutional rights, not the opinions of irrelevant pop artists who contribute nothing to serious cultural discourse." The words hung in the courtroom like a judicial slap across the face. Morrison had just dismissed Prince's expertise based solely on his profession, while simultaneously declaring that popular music had no value in serious cultural discussion. The packed courtroom, filled with legal scholars, entertainment attorneys, and civil rights advocates, fell completely silent. Everyone present understood they had just witnessed unprecedented judicial misconduct. A federal judge publicly expressing personal bias against an expert witness based on professional prejudice rather than qualifications. Before we reveal how Prince responded to this judicial insult and delivered testimony that would force Judge Morrison to issue a formal apology while creating legal precedents still cited today, let me ask you, have you ever been dismissed because of assumptions about your background rather than evaluation of your knowledge? Have you seen expertise emerge from unexpected sources? Share your thoughts in the comments, because what happened next proved that wisdom recognizes no social boundaries when delivered with sufficient authority and precision. Prince looked at Judge Morrison for a long moment, his expression showing no anger or surprise, just the kind of calm assessment that comes from years of dealing with people who mistake credentials for intelligence. "Your Honor," Prince said quietly, "with respect, I believe this court would benefit from understanding exactly what qualifies me to testify on these matters." Prince opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder of documents. "I have read every major copyright decision issued by American courts since 1909. I have studied the legislative history of the Copyright Act of 1976. I have personally litigated intellectual property disputes worth over $50 million. I have negotiated publishing agreements with every major music corporation in America." Prince paused and looked directly at Morrison. "Most importantly, I have lived the practical consequences of how copyright law actually functions in the creative economy. I understand how these legal principles affect real artists creating real art for real audiences." Prince opened another folder. "I'd like to submit into evidence my analysis of 17 federal court decisions where judges made rulings about artistic expression without understanding how creativity actually works. In every case, the court's lack of practical knowledge about artistic processes led to decisions that were later reversed on appeal." The courtroom stirred as attorneys for both sides recognized that Prince was essentially challenging the court's competence to decide artistic matters without proper expert guidance. Morrison's face reddened as he realized that Prince had just turned their confrontation into a lesson on judicial humility. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Prince continued, "I would argue that dismissing artistic testimony as irrelevant demonstrates exactly the kind of cultural bias that the First Amendment was designed to protect against. When courts decide that certain forms of expression are inherently less worthy of protection, they're making value judgments that exceed their constitutional authority." Prince was no longer just defending his right to testify. He was delivering a constitutional law lecture that was more sophisticated than anything Morrison had heard from most attorneys. For the next 4 hours, Prince presented testimony that revolutionized how the court understood artistic expression, creative borrowing, and cultural significance. He explained how musical sampling functioned as a form of cultural conversation, with each artist adding new meaning to existing works while creating something entirely original. He demonstrated how this process was identical to legal practices like citing precedents, quoting authorities, and building upon existing scholarship. Prince presented detailed analysis showing how attempts to restrict artistic borrowing would stifle innovation in the same way that overly restrictive academic citation requirements would prevent scholarly progress. Most powerfully, Prince explained how cultural discrimination, the assumption that some art forms are inherently more valuable than others, reflects the same prejudices that have been used to restrict speech rights throughout American history. Your Honor, Prince concluded, when courts protect only the forms of expression that judges personally value, they're not interpreting the Constitution. They're imposing their cultural preferences on the entire society. By the end of Prince's testimony, the courtroom atmosphere had completely transformed. Legal scholars were taking notes frantically, understanding that they were witnessing precedent-setting expert testimony that would be cited in future cases. Judge Morrison, who had begun the day with obvious contempt for Prince, found himself asking detailed follow-up questions that demonstrated genuine respect for Prince's knowledge and insights. The ultimate ruling in Campbell v. Acuff-Rose music was a unanimous Supreme Court decision in favor of fair use, a decision that legal experts directly attributed to the foundation laid by Prince's expert testimony about the nature of artistic transformation. But Prince's impact on the case extended far beyond the specific ruling. His testimony established new standards for expert witness qualifications in entertainment law cases, with courts recognizing that practical experience could be more valuable than academic credentials in certain specialized areas. More importantly, Prince's constitutional arguments about cultural bias in judicial decision-making influenced subsequent cases involving artistic expression, leading to stronger protection for diverse forms of creative speech. Judge Morrison later issued a formal written apology to Prince, acknowledging that his dismissive comments had reflected inappropriate personal bias rather than proper judicial analysis. Mr. Nelson's testimony demonstrated knowledge and insight that exceeded my own understanding of the constitutional issues at stake, Morrison wrote. My initial reaction reflected prejudice against his profession rather than evaluation of his qualifications. This court benefited significantly from his expertise. The apology was unprecedented. Federal judges rarely acknowledge errors publicly and never apologize to witnesses they have insulted from the bench. Prince's testimony in Campbell v. Acuff-Rose music became required reading in entertainment law courses, constitutional law seminars, and judicial training programs. Law schools began teaching the case as an example of how expert witnesses could provide crucial insights that traditional legal education couldn't supply. When Prince died in 2016, the American Bar Association issued a rare tribute to a non-attorney. Prince Rogers Nelson's contribution to American jurisprudence through his expert testimony in landmark copyright cases demonstrated that legal wisdom can emerge from lived experience as well as formal education. His constitutional insights continue to protect creative freedom for all Americans. Today, the principle established by Prince's testimony that cultural expertise can be more valuable than academic credentials in cases involving artistic expression has been applied in hundreds of subsequent legal decisions. Entertainment attorneys regularly cite the Prince standard when arguing that courts should consider practical artistic experience alongside formal legal training when evaluating expert testimony about creative industries. Most importantly, Prince's challenge to judicial cultural bias has influenced how courts approach cases involving minority artistic expressions, ensuring that legal decisions about creative freedom aren't filtered through the cultural preferences of predominantly white upper-class judiciary. The transcript of Prince's testimony is now preserved in the Library of Congress as a foundational document in the development of American intellectual property law. Prince Rogers Nelson proved that day that true expertise comes from deep understanding rather than formal credentials, and that the most important legal insights often come from those who live the practical consequences of judicial decisions. An irrelevant artist delivered testimony so profound that it rewrote the legal foundation of creative freedom, proving that wisdom recognizes no boundaries when spoken with sufficient authority and truth. If this story reminds you that expertise can emerge from unexpected sources and that the most important voices are often those the establishment initially dismisses, please subscribe to keep these stories alive. Because the world needs more examples of how lived experience can provide insights that formal education never could, and how true authority comes from depth of understanding rather than institutional credentials.